Good afternoon, and thank you for standing by, and welcome to the SIPP Webinar Series Conference. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. Your lines are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, you may press star followed by the number 1 to ask a question. Please unmute your phone and state your name when prompted. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Deborah Rivera. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to webinar number 2 of the SIPP webinar series. As stated, my name is Deborah Rivera, a training specialist for the Census Bureau and also co-lead of the Census Academy Training Hub project. As part of the Census Academy launch, we extended an invitation to the Survey of Income and Program Participation folks and asked them if they could put together a webinar presentation for us. And not only did they graciously accept the invitation, they turned their extensive workshop program into 7 presentations. So as I mentioned, this is webinar number 2 of the SIPP webinar series, and today we will be talking about demographics and residences. The webinar series will continue throughout the month of June, with the next webinar taking place Monday, June 17th, and that webinar will be on jobs. So please spread the word to anyone that you know may be interested in SIPP or SIPP data. A few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this webinar, and along with the PowerPoint slides, we will be posting this recording to our Census Academy site as a learning resource. We will hold off for questions until the end of the presentation, and when that time comes, please ask one question. And if you have any remaining questions at that time, you're welcome to queue up again. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Holly Fee. Holly Fee is a survey statistician in the SIPP Coordination and Outreach Branch at the U.S. Census Bureau. She has worked on SIPP in a variety of roles for almost 5 years. She holds a PhD in sociology from Bowling Green State University. Thank you so much, Holly.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Hi, and welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar will focus on demographics and residencies. As Deb said, my name is Holly Fee, and I will be the presenter for today's webinar. But also on the line, we have Shelley Irving and Matthew Marley. They are also on the SIPP Coordination and Outreach staff, and they will be fielding any questions you may have in the chat session. So make sure if you have any questions in the chat session that you either send them directly to either Matthew or Shelley, or you send them to all participants so we can better able to answer your questions in a timely manner. So as Deb mentioned, we have a SIPP webinar series throughout this month of June. And in this webinar series, we will explore the 2014 SIPP panel waves 1 and 2, particularly using our public use data. And along with our presentations, we also have supplemental materials for you. So we include exercises and handouts for most topics. And for today's webinar, we have 2 handouts for you, and I will be using those a little bit later on in the webinar. So if you don't have them ready already, please make sure that you have both of those handouts for you available. So those would be the eRel RPE handout as well as the RREL handout. And you can find the content by using the link that you see on your screen. And if you are interested in the SIPP webinar series, you can see the topics and the associated dates in which that we will have these webinars on the right of your screen. And one last note. So we kicked off the SIPP webinar series yesterday by providing an overview of the 2014 SIPP panel. And although it's not available right now online, it will be online by the end of this week. So I highly encourage you, if you did not attend yesterday's webinar, to please go back and watch and look at the materials for that overview webinar. a lot of key terms and concepts and information about the data that I will be discussing in today's webinar, as well as the rest of our series, is really stored in that overview presentation. So again, please make sure you go back and review that presentation if you have not done so already. So today's webinar will focus on residences, demographics, relationships, as well as former household members, otherwise known as Type 2 people. So starting off with residence information. So in the 2014 SIPP panel, you can get information about where the respondent lived, how long they lived at the residence, whom the respondent lived with, why the respondent moved to the address, why a new respondent had entered the residence, tenure status, otherwise as home ownership, living quarters type, as well as if the respondents had received any housing assistance. And if you're interested in the residence information, some of the key variables that you would want to look at is the SSUID. So this is the sample identifier, and this is the main identifier variable in general when working with the data. We also have household address ID at time of interview. So that's the SHHAD ID variable. And we also have the e-residence ID variable. And so this identifies the specific residence where the respondent lived during each month. So the key difference between looking at HHAD ID and residence ID is that HHAD ID is the household address at time of interview. But if you want to look at, if you're more interested in looking at movers and more of a fluid address, you want to make sure that you look at the e-residence ID. So that's the key difference between those two variables. We also have variables for duration of the residence, the type of move, looking at R mover and T mover, depending on if it's wave 1 or wave 2. We also have reasons for moving to an address with our EHC_Y variable. And then in wave 2, we ask our new household respondents the enter reason. And so you will find that value for that variable. And the last very important variable to keep in mind is the T household status variable. And so this is very important, especially when working with multiple waves of data. So this will give you an indicator of the household status for a particular respondent. So are they a continuing household respondent? Were they only in the household for part of the year? So that's also a very key important variable for users to keep in mind. Continue with our residences variables. So we have the state of residence and the metro status. We also have a monthly region of residence indicator. And we also have the indicator for whether they had received a rent subsidy or a housing voucher. If you're interested in duration, I would guide you in looking at our residential history, our H_B month and E month variables. So our B month variable will give you the month in which the resident's spell began, and our E month variable will give you the month code in which the spell ended. And for individuals who report a resident's spell beginning in January, you then can use the EHC_move year variable to get at more of a left sensor observation. So observations that really occurred or started before your window of observation started. So you would then look at their year in which they really maybe moved to that particular residence. And we also have a monthly tenure status variable for residents. Some important things for you to know about the residence section is that we collect residence information for all respondents for every month of the reference year. So we first start off collecting information in reverse chronological order. So we first ask them, where do you live currently, and then work backwards in looking at if they have lived in previous residences. Information is collected for each respondent for up to 5 residences that the respondent lived at for at least 1 month during the reference year. And households interviewed together in Wave 1 can live apart for some or all of the reference period. And why would that be the case if you would see them living together for some or all, or living apart from each other for some or all of the reference year? The key part with this is that as long as the respondent is in the household at time of interview, they are part of the sample. And so at time of interview, we then ask them the preceding calendar year, which we call the reference period. So in Wave 1, we interviewed folks in 2014, but the reference period refers to calendar year 2013. And so as long as individuals are living together at time of interview, they are part of the sample, but during the reference year in which we're collecting those data, we may see them live together for some or no part of the reference year. And a common reason for that may be that the residence spells can include time in group quarters or medical institutions, emergency or transitional shelters, unoccupied tents or trailers, or cars or vans, or time spent living out of the country even. And these person-month records for respondents that are living in institutionalized group quarters or overseas for all or part of the reference year, but who were present in the household for Wave 1 interview, they are included on the file. And then when you look at the weight information for these folks, these records are then weighted to 0 because these respondents are not part of the survey universe for those months. So again, the survey universe, or SIPP, is the non-institutionalized U.S. population. So if you're interested in looking at residences information over time, there are some terms that are really important to keep in mind when working with data across waves. The first term is the original sample person, or OSP, and so this is everyone in the interviewed Wave 1 household. In subsequent waves, SIPP attempts to interview every OSP, as well as any new people who have moved into the household with the OSP or who lived with the OSP at any time during the previous year. So for those OSPs who leave the original household, we will follow them as long as they remain in the survey universe. Again, the civilian, non-institutionalized population in the U.S. So these original sampled households are also known as parent households. And when they do move, they are known as spawns. So spawns are interviewed Wave 1 individuals who then move in Waves 2+. And spawn cases are also known as child cases. And then when we interview folks at those child cases, if they then move in subsequent waves, and we follow them, they are then called a grandchild case. So a grandchild case is a spawn of a spawn. So when you are looking at movers, you can identify unique households by using both the sample unit identifier, so the SSUID variable, as well as the household monthly residence ID. So that's that e-residence ID variable. So you must use both of those variables together when identifying movers. And to help you identify movers, there's a lot of great information in the e-residence ID variable that will help you better track movers. So to give you an idea, when you look at the first value of e-residence, the first value identifies the wave in which the address appears in the data. So if we look at the example of the 3 e-residence IDs here on the screen, we see that the first address was identified in Wave 1, denoted by the 1, and we see that these two addresses were identified in wave 2, denoted by the 2. When you look at the second digit in the e-residence ID variable, this identifies whether the household was a spawn between waves. And a value of 0 indicates that it is a parent household, but if you see a value of an A or B or C and so on, that lets you know that this is a child case. So it's either an A is for the first case, B is for the second case, and C is for the third case, and so on. So continuing with our examples here on the screen, we see that this first e-residence ID is in fact a parent household, and we see that the second and third one are child cases. But if you look at the third digit in the e-residence ID, this indicates whether a case is a grandchild or not, so again, a spawn of a spawn. And in this case, what we see by looking at our third example, we see that in fact this is a grandchild case that was identified in wave 2. And the second example here on the screen is in fact a child case, since we see that the third digit is a 0. And of course, we know that the first example is a parent household. And the last 3 digits in the e-residence ID is essentially a sequential numbering of addresses associated with an original sample unit, or SSUID, that enter the sample in the same wave. So there's a lot of great information that you can detect by just looking at the e-residence ID. So to give you a better idea of what the residence data looks like, so this is demonstration data. What you see here on the screen is one household, one person showing 12 months of data. So again, remember, our public use data is released at a person month level. And so for most individuals, there would be 12 records per person. You may not see 12 records for individuals such as infants, but most individuals will have 12 records. So we see for this person that they have 2 residences spells. So their first spell, by looking at the residential history _B month variable, began in January of the reference year. And we see that it ended in June of that year. And we can see their second spell here highlighted on the screen. In the pink color, we see that the second spell began in July and then ended in December of the reference year. So continuing on with that example and looking at other variables in the data, we see, recall that the first spell began in January of the reference year. But again, if you're interested in kind of more left sensor information, we look at the TEHC_move year variable, and we see in fact that for this person, they had moved into this particular residence in 2010. So it didn't really start in January of the reference year. They really moved there in 2010. And as before, we saw that their second spell started in July. And we look at the RMove variable. In this case, this is wave 1 data. And again, this is their kind of their status variable. We see on that record in which they moved, so in July, we see that their RMove value is a 1, which indicates that they were a non-mover. But in the month that they moved, we see it changes from a 1 to a 3, which indicates that they moved to a different house in the U.S., same state, but just a different county. And then we see their preceding records after that move had occurred became a non-mover again. So that's another trick where you can look at the data and see when a spell maybe began and started by looking at the RMover variable. And again, we see these two separate residency spells highlighted here. But if we look at their tenure variable and the Y that they had moved to that particular residence, we see that for their first spell, their tenure value is a 2, which indicates that they were a renter, and they had moved to that residence because of a change in marital or relationship status. But the reason why they started their second spell is that their tenure value changes from a 2 to a 1, which indicates that they went from a renter to an owner, and the reason why they moved is that they wanted to own a home and not rent. Here's another example for you. So in this example, one household, 4 people living in the home, showing you January and December of the reference year. So we see January up here and December down here. We see that in December, individuals 101 through 104 are all living together in one residence. But we see, if we look back at their data in January, we see that persons 101 and 103 were living together as indicated by their value in e-residence ID. And persons 102 and 104 were living together because they share an e-residence ID, the same. So in this example, persons 101 and 102 got married sometime in between January and December of the reference year as indicated by their change in marital status. And we'll get to demographics a little bit later on, but just to kind of give you some context, we added some demographic characteristics here for you. And so we could then assume, because of that marriage, persons 102 and 104 had moved into the home of person 101 and 103, because they all share, again, that 101 e-residence ID value. So continuing on with the example that we just reviewed, except this time we're adding wave 2 data. And this would be a wide format for you, so where each variable is in a separate column. And just to review, when you're working with data across waves in a wide format, you want to make sure that you create wave-specific variables before you merge. And depending on your statistical programming package that you're using, you'll either override your data or won't be able to merge your data. So here we just simply added a suffix to our wave-specific variables. So again, you want to make sure that you have wave-specific variables before you merge if you're working in a wide format. And for here, creating a wave-specific variable for a month code is not necessary, but I do it here just to demonstrate that in wave 2, the month code value is still 1 through 12, like it is in wave 1 and how it is for subsequent waves. But if you were merging this in a wide format, and we show you in our overview presentation how to do that, and we provide code for you, you would merge this by SSUID, PNUM, and month code. So looking at this example, looking at the household status variable, we see that in wave 1, so we have wave 1 up here, we see the household status variable value is a 2. And so that indicates that they are a new household member, which makes sense because we're looking at wave 1 2014 data, and so since this is the first wave, all people are new. So you'll see a value of 2 for household status. But when they come back for wave 2, we see that their household status value is 1 in this example, which indicates that they are a returning household member. And in wave 1, we see that persons 101 and 102 were married. But when we look at wave 2, as highlighted there in the blue box, we see that persons 101 and 102 had unfortunately got a divorce when we interviewed them in wave 2. And we see that reflected in the e-residence ID. Again, we see persons 101 and 103 had moved into a new residence, while person 102 and 104 had moved into their own separate residence. And recall, when looking at the value of e-residence ID, so notice how the new residence ID begins with a 2 is because these addresses were identified in wave 2. And they were all spawned off from the parent, as you see here, and we see that this is just simply the first spawn, and then B would indicate that it's just simply the second spawn of the parent household. So that's what the data would look like in a wide format. But if you wanted to look at the data in a more of a long format or a stacked format, this is what it would look like. So this is exactly the same information that we just reviewed, just in a long format. And the line here just simply separates out wave 1 information to wave 2 information. And again, recall when working with long data, before you merge the wave 2 data with the wave 1 data, you want to make sure that you add 12 to month code so then the value in wave 2 for month code would be 13, 14, 15, and so on. So simply kind of creating a cumulative month code rather than duplicating the 1 through 12 again. So just like we just reviewed, looking at their status or household, their value for household status, we see that in wave 2, the folks got a divorce, and then they had moved to separate residences. So here's a new example, and I really want to emphasize household status and what the data would look like if folks were not in the household for the duration of the reference year. So this is one household. There are 2 people living in the household, and we show you month 12 of wave 1, and then we show you data for wave 2. So first, starting off looking at the wave 1 data, we see that person 101 and 102 are married to each other, and they're living at this sampled address. And they are, in fact, new household members with a value of 2 for household status. But then when we look at the wave 2 data, we see that for person 101, they had a birthday in January, as showing they're a year older, starting in wave 2. And we see for person 101 that their monthly marital status changes from a 1 to a 3, which indicates that they are married and then they become widowed in March of wave 2. And we see that reflected for person 102. So recall, person 102 is their spouse. And we see for January of wave 2, their household status is a 3, which indicates that they are a partial reference year household person in wave 2. And we also see that information for February of wave 2. They have a value of 3. So person 102 is in the house for the months of January and February in wave 2. So we see that they have a person record. But recall, person 101, their spouse, became widowed in March, right here. And so person 102 does not have any personal records beyond February of Wave 2. And we see that reflected here. So when we look at March and April and December for person 101, we see that person 102 no longer has a person record. And for this household, it just would continue to be person 101. So that is the end of the residence material. We will now turn to demographics. So in the SIPP, we contain age, sex, marital status, race and Hispanic origin, nativity, citizenship, language, and parent mortality. Some of the key variables that you would want to look at is we have T-age, and this is the age in the interview month. So this will not change. This value will not change over the reference period. So you will see the same value copied for each month for every person. But if you're interested in looking at when the person experiences change in age or when they have their birthday, you would want to look at the TH_EHC variable. We also have birth year for you, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and an indicator whether the respondent was born in the U.S. or not. We also have state in which the respondent was born, whether they are a citizen, how they became a citizen, the year of entry, their immigration status at time of entry, language spoken at the home, and also how well they speak English. If you're interested in union status variables, we have EMS. So this is the marital status at the interview month. Again, similar to age, this value will not change over the reference period. But if you're interested in looking at more of a dynamic measure and looking at change, you would want to look at the MS_EHC variable. So this is our monthly marital status variable. We also collect information for the first year of marriage, the year of the current marriage, and we have indicators for whether the respondent was ever widowed or divorced. And we also have the number of times the respondent has been married. Some important things to know about our demographic content is that most of the demographic data are collected at time of interview. So with age, we create a monthly variable based on our interview date and the birth date of the respondent. Marital status changes are collected in our event history calendar, so the EHC, and they are available at a monthly level. Other important things to know is that we ask at interview about the current marital status. And for those who report having been married, we then collect data on their first year of marriage, their current year of marriage, and the number of times that they had been married. So if a respondent had only been married once, the value for the first year of marriage and current year of marriage would be the same. So if you just got married in 2012, you would see that 2012 value reflected in both of those variables. And if you are interested in looking at the year of a second or third year, third marriage, we don't collect that data in the SIPP. So it's only their first and their current year that you would have that information. And by using the EHC, then we can see spells of marital change. So if you're interested in looking at perhaps a single person getting married or transitioning to a cohabiting relationship or a cohabiting relationship transitioning into a marital relationship, you can see all of those changes in using the SIPP data. And the last note that we have for you is that the year of birth and death of the mother and father variables, they are only available for Wave 1 of the 2014 panel. In Wave 2, we do have a mortality indicator, so you will know if their parent, if their mother or father is alive or not, but you just don't have as detailed as information as the year as we have for Wave 1. So to give you an idea of what the data look like, this is an example this is one household, one person showing all 12 months. And we see that if we look at the T-age variable, again, so this is the age at interview. We see this person was 36 years old at time of interview. But if you look at the T-age underscore EHC variable, this is that monthly variable. We see that for this person, they were 35 for the majority of the reference year, but in December, as highlighted in the box, they have their birthday, and then they turn 36 in December. And similarly, looking at marital status, we see at time of interview, again, looking at the EMS variable, we see that this person is married, but if we look at the reference year, the EMS underscore EHC variable, we see this person is never married, and then in May, this person became married, as highlighted there in the box. So this is what the data, again, would look like within a wave, and this is wave 1 example data. But if we would look at the data across waves, again, we see, continuing with our previous example, one person, same household, and in this case, this person did not move. They still are living in the sampled original parent household, as you can see from the e-residence ID. And again, just emphasizing that in our wave 2 data, if you do not modify it, the month code values do continue to range 1 through 12. And we see this person, we just saw this information, they had turned 36 during the reference year. And we see in the wave 2 data, this person now is 37 at time of interview, and they have that birthday again in December. And if you're curious in looking at these data in a long format, again, just showing you the same thing, just in the different layout and the same information that we just reviewed, but in a stacked format. So that's our demographics information. Now we will turn and discuss relationships. So in the SIPP data, in the 2014 panel, you can get information about the relationship of other individuals in the home to the householder. We have information on spouse and cohabiting partner identification variables, as well as parent and child identification variables. And you can also get at the type of parent. So are they a biological parent, an adopted parent, a step parent? And so, but beyond the relationship with the householder, you can also disentangle the relationships with everybody in the household. So you can get at the relationships to each person in the household. And we also include a family identification variable. So if you're interested in these data, our interview month variables, again, if you have the handouts for today's webinar handy, you can go ahead and grab the eRel RPE handout. And so this is the relationship to the householder. And you can see what values for that variable correspond to what type of relationship. And I'd mentioned that we have the spouse and cohabiting partner identification variables. And so this is our PN spouse and PN cohab variable. And if you're interested in looking at parent and child relationships, we have our PN par 1 and par 2. So this is the PNUM of the parent 1 and parent 2. And we have the type of relationship, parent relationship the parent has with the child. And as well as we have our PN child 1 through 19. So this is the PNUM of the child or the children in the household in which the parent is associated with. And we have the type of children in the household. So these values are at interview month. So these values will not change over the reference period. But if you wanted to get at more of a dynamic perspective on relationships, you would want to look at the monthly variables. So again, we have our spouse and cohabiting partner pointer variables, our identification variables, in the PN spouse underscore EHC and cohab underscore EHC. And also the second handout that you will see for today's webinar is the RREL handout. And so this shows the type of relationship to each person in the household. And by using that handout, you can see the associated value of that variable when you are trying to disentangle relationships in the household. And with the RREL, we also have the RREL underscore PNUM 1 through 30. So this is the relationship for this particular person that's associated with their PNUM number. And again, if you're looking at parent-child relationships, you would want to look at our PN par1 underscore HC and par1 type underscore HC variables to look at the PNUM of parent 1 and 2 and what type of parent they are. And here we have our family identification number as well as the kind of family and the PNUM for the family reference number. Some important things to note when working with the relationships data. So on the child's records, we provide edited monthly parent identification variables to identify any parents they live with in that month, along with the type of relationship, so the biological, step, or adoptive parent. And on the parent's record, we create a vector that establishes all the children a parent reported. So the children listed are those present in the household at interview month. And so there is no monthly variation. So when I talk about that variable, if you refer to a few slides back, these are the two variables that I'm kind of referring to when there's no monthly variation. The third point there, so the vector of the monthly relationships must be used in conjunction with the vector of person numbers for that month. And this is a very important key point to keep in mind, and we'll highlight this a little bit later. But what I mean by that, with those variables that I'm explicitly referring to with that point, are these two variables here. So the RREL 1 through 30 vector, as well as the RREL underscore PNUM. So you want to make sure that you use both of these when looking at relationships in the household, and I'll show you why it's very important for you to use both of those variables. And our last point there on the screen is that status flags or allocation variables, maybe you know them by. So for the par1 type underscore HC and the par2 type underscore HC, those are only available for wave 1 data only. And so as mentioned in yesterday's webinar on the overview, just about all of our edited variables have status flags associated with them. But for this particular variable, it's only available in wave 1. So to give you an idea of what the relationships data look like in SIPP, so this is an example where we see two households. Household 1 has 3 people, and household 2 has 4 people. And just for example purposes, we just show you January of this year. And this is another, I'd be highlighting the eREL RPE handout. So if you have that handy, feel free to grab that now. So looking at household 1, by looking at the REL RPE handout, we see that a value of 1 is associated with the householder with relatives. A value of 3 is the opposite sex spouse. So we see for person 101, who is the householder, we see that their opposite sex spouse is person 102. And we see a value of 7 is associated with the child. So we see that person 103 is the child for person 101, who is the householder. So again, the rel RPE is the variable for the relationship to the householder. And if we use those spouse pointer identification variables, we can get this similar type of information. We see that for person 101, their spouse is person 102, and for person 102's record, we see that their spouse is person 101 for January. Again, we're only looking at 1 month here. But if we look at the child's record, again, a similar information that we got from the household relationship variable, we see that the first parent listed for person 103 is person 102, and their second parent is person 101. And we see that both of them are biological parents. And we see that information then reflected on the parent's record. We see that their first child in the household is person 103. So now turning to the second household, we see in this case person 102 is the householder, and person 101 is their opposite sex partner, and we see that person 103 is their child, and person 104 with the value of 18 is other non-relative. And again, like we saw in the previous example, we see that for person 103, their parent is person 102, is their biological parent with a value of 1 for par 1 type. And on person 104's record, we see that their parent is person 101, and again, it's their biological parent. And again, we see that same information reflected on the parent's record. We see the children that they point to. So now turning to different examples here, this time using the RREL and the RREL PNUM vectors. So again, if you would want to refer to the RREL handout now, we will be using that handout. So here's an example. There are 2 households. The first household has 3 people. The second household has 4. Again, just showing you January of the reference here. So we see by using the RREL vector with the PNUM, we see similar information. But again, if you're interested in understanding all relationships and not just the relationship to the householder, you want to use the RREL and the RREL PNUM variables. So in this case, if you look at the value of 99 for RREL, it is associated with self. So we see on person 101's record, it's associated with 101. And we see the same information on person 102's record, it's the self with 102. And if we look at a value of 1, we would see that it is associated with opposite sex spouse. So we see on person 101's record, the second person in the household is their opposite sex spouse. And who does that point to? If we look at the associated PNUM 2 value, we see that their opposite sex spouse is person 102. And if we look at person 102's record, we see that same information reflected. So the first person in the household is their opposite sex spouse. Who does that point to? Person 101. And if we look at the child's record, person 103, we see that their relationship to persons 1 and 2 in the household is a 5. And so that is an indicator for a biological parent or child. And we see that same information when we look at the parent's record, it's the biological parent or child. and we see who it points to by looking at the RREL PNUM variables. And just to know, when using the RREL and the RREL PNUM variables, make sure that you look at associated demographic information to really kind of unpack who is the parent and who is the child. So in this case, we added T-age for you. And so if you look at T-age, you will see that person 103 is 7 years old. So it's pretty safe to assume that they are then the child in this relationship and not the parent. So make sure that you're looking at associated demographic information. Looking at the second household, again, we see the value of 99 is associated with that person's record. Again, 101, they are themselves is associated with 101. And in this case, when we look at a value of 2, this is opposite sex unmarried partner. So we see, looking at person 101's record, the second person in the household is their opposite sex unmarried partner, and it points to person 102. We see the same information reflected on person 102's record. And again, unpacking parent-child relationships, we see that for person 101, their relationship with the fourth person in the household is a biological parent-child, and we see that points to person 104. And again, you would want to look at something like age to just verify that, in fact, yes, person 104 is 14 years old, whereas person 101 is 39. So you could then tell who's the parent, who's the child. But it's not, the RREL and RREL PNUM is not just restricted to parent-child relationships or spouse or partner relationships. Again, you can unpack all relationships with all individuals in the household. So in this case, going back and looking at person 101, the third person in the household is associated with 17. Well, if you look at your handout, a value of 17 is associated with other relative, and that points to person 103. So we know that person 101, their relationship with person 103 is other relative. And we see that same information reflected on person 102 and 103 and 104's record. So we see for person 102, their fourth person in the household is also another relative, and that's person 104. And again, if you're curious in understanding the relationships in this example of the children in the household, if we look at person 103's record, their relationship with the fourth person in the household is a 19. So if you look at your handout, a value of 19 is associated with other non-relative. So we know that person 104 is an other non-relative to person 104. And again, we get the same information if you look at person 104's record. The third person in the household is a value of 19, and that's associated with person 103. That is an other non-relative. Okay, so here's another example, a different example. So this is one household showing 3 people, and we just showing you January and February of the reference year. We see that for person 101, their relationship with the second person in the household is opposite sex spouse, and we see that then is associated with person 102 by using the PNUM. But if we look at February, the relationship to the second person now switches from an opposite sex spouse to a biological parent-child. So what happened there? This is again, this is an example where you want to make sure that you are using the RL in conjunction with the RL PNUM. Because what happened in February of the reference month is, again, going back to the e-residence variable. So relationships in SIPP are based on a shared address for that month. And what happened, we see if we look at person 102's record for February, they have a different e-residence ID. So for some reason, person 102 was not living at the residence in February. And so what happened, person 103 had shifted into occupying the second person in that household, as you see reflected here. So again, make sure you are always using RL and RL PNUM in conjunction to better understand relationships in the household, and also keep in mind the e-residence ID variable. So that's what the data look like within a wave. And if we add wave 2 data to this example, again, we see the same information that we just reviewed, and that in February of the reference year, person 102 had moved out temporarily. Because notice how the RL1 variable is 99, so self, and their PNUM value is 102. So the same information that we just saw, now adding wave 2 data, so this is a wide format, wave-based. We see that in wave 2 that now, looking at the pink highlighted boxes, we see that in January of the second wave, person 102 has now moved to a completely new residence, as identified with their 2A. So they now have spawned off and have created a child, or a child address. And we see that they are the only person in the household, as evidenced by the RL value is 99, and it's associated with their PNUM value of 102. And that is continuing on into February of the reference year. So that's what the data look like in a wide format. If you're interested in working with the data in a long format, this is what the data will look like, and exactly what we just reviewed and showed, but just in a stacked format. And here we just show you January of wave 2. We see that person 102 is now living at a different residence, as reflected in using the RL and the RL PNUM vector. We see that they are the first person in their household, because they are now living separately from person 101 and 103. So that is the end of the relationships section. We will now discuss type 2 people, so former household members. So type 2 people are people who lived in the house with the household member, but they are no longer living at the interviewed address at time of interview. So type 2 folks may have lived with our household member at that address, or they could have lived with them at a separate address. But sometime during the reference year, these folks lived with our household member, but at time of interview, they are no longer living at that address. And type 2 people were added starting in the 2014 panel. So we switched from a being interviewed from a quarter basis down to an annual basis. And we were concerned with losing kind of those transit temporary household folks. And so we added a section to collect information about those individuals, and we call them type 2 people. We have limited information about the type 2 folks, but if you are interested in them, here are some key type 2 people variables. So we have their line number, we have the months that they live with the type 2 people, we have collect information about their sex, age, an indicator whether they had worked or not, and their income. some key important things that you want to take note when looking at type 2 folks is that type 2 people do not have a person record in the data. So when you look at the public use data file, you will not see a person record for these people. But they do exist on the records of our interviewed respondents as someone to whom the respondent points to. So you will be able to unpack the household relationships. And we also have, again, the basic demographic information on the type 2 people. And the type 2 people, they will show up on the household rosters. Other important information to know about the type 2 people is that type 2 people are eligible to be selected as recipients of respondents' programs such as health insurance or TANF, and we will cover those topics a little bit later in our webinar series. And so we'll see the type 2 people pop up back then. And we also include a version of the monthly household poverty and income estimates that include and exclude type 2 people. And so to give you an idea of what the data look like for type 2 people, so on the screen you will see 2 households. The first household has 2 people. And as the second household also has 2 people. And then in this case, we just show you 2 months of data for during the reference year. So first, turning to the first household, we see that their line number is 60. So the line numbers for type 2 people actually range from 60 to, I believe, 69. And so you will see those values associated with their line number or their PNUM values. And we see, again, using our REL variables, our relationship variables, we see that the relationship for the third person in the household was, again, a biological parent or child. And we see who it points to, we see that the PNUM value is 60. So by seeing that, you know that's a type 2 person. And again, like I said, we include basic demographic information about these folks. And in this case, this type 2 person is a male. He's 24 years old. He did work and he made $15,000. So he's in the household in January of the reference year. But if we look at August of the reference year, we now see missing data for that type 2 person. So sometime in between January and August, the type 2 person had moved out of the home. Now turning to our second household there, we see in August, they too did have a type 2 person as indicated by a value of 60. And we see for person 101, their relationship with that type 2 person was a value of 19. So if you look at your handout, that indicates that the type 2 person was an other non-relative in relation to person 101, but for person 102, that type 2 person was their biological parent or child. And in this case, we see that the person was a female and she was 8 years old. And notice how there's missing data for work and income is because this 8-year-old was not in universe to be asked whether she had worked in the income. So you will see missing data in that case. So she is not, and recall, in SIPP, we consider an adult to be 15 years age or older. So since she is 8, she is missing in those data. And we see by the end of the year, by December, this person had moved out. So between August through sometime through December, this person was no longer living in the house. But if we add Wave 2 data, using an example that we just reviewed, again, we see the same information looking at our Wave 1 data for the type 2 person. It was a biological child, and then by August, they had moved out. And if we look at the Wave 2 data, again, the same household has a Type 2 person in August of Wave 2. And another important point to highlight is that these PNUM values or LNO values for the Type 2 people, they do not carry between waves. It's only within waves, or it's only within a wave that they have that value. So in this example, we see a PNUM value or an LNO value in Wave 2 of a Type 2 person, but that is not the same Type 2 person that was in the household in Wave 1. So again, those values do not carry between waves. And in this case, if we look at our REL variable, the Type 2 person is at a value of 17 for persons 101 and 102. So that is an other relative, and we see that then reflected. Their other relative is that Type 2 person. That's what the data look like in a wide format. In a long format, this is what the data would look like. Again, it would be a stacked data set. And the same information that we just reviewed, we see that in January of Wave 1, there's a Type 2 person in the household. By August, in Wave 1, they are gone. And then in Wave 2, in August, we see a different Type 2 person come into the household. And so that concludes our Type 2 section. We will finish today's webinar just discussing some additional resources. So there is supplemental webinar material for this webinar, and this is all located on today's webinar page. And so we include exercises. So with our exercises, we have worksheet handouts as well as SAS and STATA solution code. And so we have exercises for residences, demographics, as well as relationships. And so this is the file name format. And so the S is simply associated with the solution, and I think we have about 2 exercises each for each topic. We also have those handouts that we referred to throughout today's webinar. So that, again, that's the REL RPE. So this is the detailed categories for the relationship to the household respondent. But we also have the REL handout, and this is the monthly household relationship to everybody in the household. And again, if you are curious and have not done so already, downloaded materials, you can find them at the hyperlink there on your screen. Data resources for you, always check out the SIPP website there at census.gov/SIPP. We also have the Census FTP site, and so you can download data not just for SIPP, but also for other census data sets at the address there highlighted on your screen, as well as the NBER SIPP webpage. So this is the National Bureau of Economic Research. They also have a great SIPP page, and feel free to check out that hyperlink there on your screen. Any technical documentation, please check out, again, our SIPP website. And currently we have available the user's guide, metadata, any release notes, user notes, code book, and as well as crosswalks. And if you're curious about any of the residences or demographics research that's been done using the 2014 panel, we do have a P70 report, so a population report on demographics and living arrangements in 2013, and there's a hyperlink there for you out to that report. And that's it for today's webinar. Our next webinar is scheduled for June 17th, and we will cover jobs data. And again, if you're curious about this webinar series, please check out the hyperlink there. And then we also have on the right of your screen the schedule that's coming up. Again, thank you for attending today's webinar. And we will now open the line for questions. And if you have any questions later on, feel free to contact us at our email or give us a call. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. At this time, if you do have any questions or comments, you may press star 1. Again, that is star 1 if you do have any questions or comments. Please unmute your phones and state your names when prompted. Once again, that is star 1 if you would like to ask a question. At this time, I am showing no questions. One moment, please. We do have a question.
I was listening at the presentation, and to be honest, I'm really confused. So is there...
Shirley Smalls has a question. Shirley, you may go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. I've been listening to the presentation, and to be honest, I am completely confused. So is there some other material that I can, review and sort of get a better understanding? Because I did follow you, the presentation. I did pull up the information and sort of follow you, but it's still confusing. So do you suggest that or do you have a website where I can go and review the codes and get a better understanding?
Hi, Shirley. This is Holly. So did you happen to catch yesterday's webinar on our overview or not?
I did.
Okay, great. We will be posting the recorded version no later. It'll be up by the end of this week. I would encourage maybe to go back and review that. You could also always check out our SIPP website. I would always start off by looking at our data users guide. That would be a great starter for you. And if you have any questions, feel free to email or call us. I'm not quite sure what area maybe is unclear for you, where maybe I could give you more directed resource, but I would check out our website.
Well, I got sort of lost when we were talking about the cross waves and the first wave and the second wave and those numbers there, the 101 and the 102. The 101 and 102, I understand that's with the 101, I think, is the head of the household, and 102 is when they are married.
Are you talking about the PNUM values?
Yep.
Okay, so that is just simply a household, it's a person number in the household. So 101 is just simply the first person in the household. 102 is the second person in the household. And so that would be for wave 1, because those folks were identified and entered the household in wave 1. When we look at wave 2 or wave 3 or wave 4, if new individuals enter the household, that first digit for PNUM, like for example wave 2, the first digit of PNUM would begin with 2 because they entered the household in wave 2. And then it would just be a subsequent counting. So if they're the first person to enter the household in wave 2, their PNUM value would be 201, and the second person would be 202, and so on.
Because that's wave 2, right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so, I mean, it's very interesting. You just said I'd just like to really get a better understanding.
Yeah, I would, our user's guide is a great starting point, as well as reviewing the overview material and going back. And I know when it's a lot to take in, and yeah, just going back and reviewing today's webinar. And again, if you have any questions in particular, feel free to email us, or you can even email me directly.
Okay. So the email address that I'm looking at, is that the question and answer email address?
You can
www.census.gov/SIP?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so let me review this information, and if I have any question, I definitely will contact you. And thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And at this time, I am showing no further questions.
Okay, great. So if there are no more questions in the queue, then that will conclude today's session. Please keep an eye out for the recorded webinar resources. Those should be available by the end of the week. I am aiming to have them somewhere on the, or up on the site somewhere between tomorrow and Thursday, but at the very latest will be Friday afternoon. And we encourage you to join us again on Monday, June 17th for our next SIPP webinar on jobs. That concludes today's session. Thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
And thank you. This concludes today's conference call. You may go ahead and disconnect at this time.